Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here at what I think is going to be a very exciting panel to talk about one of the fundamental challenges that's affecting the world, and that is the issue of the impact of illegal drugs on communities and individuals the world over. But nowhere perhaps is it more impactful or impacted than in the Americas. And today we're really fortunate to have two outstanding individuals who have been global leaders into the issue of moving policies that are going to reduce harm and reduce the impact of illegal drugs. To my immediate left is Marina Elena Medina Mora. Dr. Medina Mora is the Director General of the National Institute for Psychiatry in Mexico. And Rodrigo Guerrero is the mayor of Cali, Colombia, who has done extraordinary work in reducing gun violence, violence due to drugs in his community. And he's also an epidemiologist trained at Harvard. So I'm going to just preface by saying that there's a number of exciting things happening in the near future. The UN General Assembly, for the first time in 20 years, is going to deal with drug policy and reducing harm, looking at drug abuse in hopefully a different way. And in the face of that is the backdrop of a continent, North and South America, that are being torn apart by illegal drugs. In this country, more than 30,000 people overdose every single year. In Mexico, I want you to remember one number, 60,000. 60,000 are the number of people who have been killed, mostly innocent people, as a consequence of the trafficking of drugs and basically the consumption of illegal drugs in the United States and Canada. So thank you very much, Maria Elena and Rodrigo, for being here today. Maria Elena, I'd like to first ask you the situation currently in Mexico with respect to the impact of illegal drugs on your country.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for being here. Maybe if we use Tom Baber's paradigm to analyze what's the drug problems in different countries. Mexico defines the drug problem as of national security and has a very increasing but low rate of drug use, certainly increasing, low problematic drug use, and low to medium drug dealing in the communities, but very high problem with narco traffic and a very, very, very high rate of murders to the point that right now young males are reducing their life expectancy. For the first time in our history, life expectancy has been reduced, and this is young males, and this is for homicide, most of it related to the guns and drugs. So the situation, I think, is quite bad. It's different from other countries.
Thank you very much, Maria Elena. Rodrigo, take us back to 1993 in Cali, Colombia, and give the attendees here a picture of what that looked like.
Well, first, thanks for inviting me to this panel. I have lived all this year through this program, but I am not an expert in drugs. But I'll give you my impressions. First, the analogy I can make with the drug problem in Colombia is equivalent to what happened in the Middle Ages with plague. It's something that falls upon society and changes dramatically everything, all the institutions, political, social, etc. It goes to a point that threatens the existence of the state. We had that back in 1983, when the guerrillas decided that they will use coca production to finance their guerrilla activities in Colombia. I do have some slides showing the number of fronts of the guerrillas starting in 1983 because they took that decision. So it has fueled a long-lasting guerrillas that had existed for 40 years. They were about to be extinguished, but all of a sudden they grabbed the opportunity to live out of the drug traffic and they changed dramatically the picture of the guerrilla in Colombia. There was a point in which they, as I mentioned, they were threatening the existence of the state by itself. But fortunately, the things have calmed down. So the first thing is the equivalent to the plague has permeated all walk of life. They even got to a point in which they financed one president of Colombia, was elected with the support, financial support of the drug traffickers. So you can imagine to what extent. This will be the thing. Then there are two actions that are related to that. First is violence by itself. As you can imagine, drug traffickers cannot rely on the judicial system to solve their problems. It doesn't make sense to want to go and say, look, this fellow owes me 1 ton of coca. So what they have to do is resort to violence, which is the way they settle. So violence is closely linked to solving problems because they are outside. So that's one direct effect. But then another more important is that which is something I discovered over the years. When I first was mayor in 1992, I was convinced that all the violence in Cali was due to the direct effect of the drug traffickers. But then when we began to study the distribution, we saw that most of the killings of homicides took place on weekends. They were associated with heavy consumption of alcohol. And so we began to rethink about the hypothesis that we had initially. But then, what I have come to the conclusion over the years is what drug traffic did to Colombia was the equivalent what the HIV virus does to the human body. It attacks the defense mechanism, which is the police and the judicial system. They did effectively attack them. The police, for example, the police commander of Cali was on the payroll of the drug cartels. The drug enforcement official was on the payroll of the Cali cartel, down to the one that my bodyguard was all the payroll. So they have permeated police, and they permeated the judicial system. So when that occurs, people begin to kill for simple things. In the similar fashion to when you don't have the defense mechanism of the body, the lymphocytes functioning, you end up being killed by things normally you wouldn't die.
So what did you do? The murder rate at that time was about, to give you an indication, it was about 120 per 100,000 people, which is twice what it was in Detroit. But as an epidemiologist, you did some very interesting things to reduce violence in Cali. Can you share with the attendees what you did?
Well, as I was mentioning, when we did what we call the descriptive studies, who, where, when, we noticed there were young people, unemployed, coming from mostly males, coming from the poorer areas of the city, and took place in weekends and were related to alcohol consumption. So we passed a restriction on alcohol consumption in public spaces. After 2 a.m., bars, drinking places were closed in Cali, and put restriction on carrying firearms because 90% of the killings were carried out by firearms. Those two measures were very effective. But simultaneously, we began to work with the youth, offer them income opportunities, schooling opportunities, because we knew that by itself will not solve the problem. But there were measures that we did and we evaluated, and all along we were able to do that.
So these are very much a social interventions to deal with the violence and in Cali at the time. You didn't use so much a judicial option. So Maria Elena, what, from your perspective, what do you think Mexico or other Latin American countries can learn from what Rodrigo used in Cali?
Well, a lot, I would say, because we see in Colombia our hope, but just let me add some comments to the situation in Mexico. of course, drugs in Colombia, in Mexico, and many other countries, what they is corrupt the system. They corrupt the system. So the system is corrupted from top to bottom. And but the drugs that are an arm for the organized crime are not the only source of revenue. So the organized crime might be organized, might in the past because of the drugs, but when, for instance, drugs stopped coming from Colombia through Mexico to come to Europe, to go to Europe, that's when, they started going that way. And then for some international negotiations, the Caribbean route, which was the most common route used by the cocaine coming from Colombia to go to Europe, stopped coming from Mexico because of the interventions that the government was making and making seizures of cocaine. Then Mexico started to have a very dishonored place of dealing with young girls for sexual commerce, and these organizations introduce tobacco without paying taxes, introduce illegal or unrecorded alcohol, introduce whatever they have. No? So drugs are one important arm, but are not the only one. So we have to take that into consideration. And at this moment, I think we are in the worst moment, maybe similar to what Rodrigo found when he was a major, that it was very lucky Colombia to have him at that time having this public health perspective. And I think that what we have to see is a public health perspective. Considering that not all the problems are drugs, that there are many other problems, and that we have different problems to deal with. But if we continue to consider the problem as a national security problem and have the main aim of the action of the government to seize drugs and to put people in jail, that's not going to solve the problem. What's happening is that Central America is getting the problem we had, because I think drugs are like water. You close one way and then they will find another one. And Central America, I think, is now worse than we are. So the situation is that
if we could just tell the violent in Honduras, El Salvador. Some of the attendees may not know how violent those countries are.
Well, it's really, I mean, what happens in the international scene, without saying this happens in these countries, is that usually the drugs find a way where they are weakness in control, in development, in activity. So when the drugs come to a country, to a poor country, they make a very terrible effect. And then homicides is growing, and now Salvador has the highest rate in the world. And that's it happened because the drugs stopped coming through Mexico. Part of it still. So we produce heroin and methamphetamine, so we still have a very big problem. But I just gave an example, not because I think we don't have that problem anymore, but to think that drugs are not the only problem. So when we think what are we going to do, we have to consider that we need a global action. And then Rodrigo has wonderful examples. But what we, I think, have to do is to change our point of view for a public health perspective related to the drug problem. And this means that we need to face the problem in a different way, not having people in jail, because that's not a solution for a drug problem. We need, and in the jails right now in Mexico, we have two types of problems. Of course, people that commit crime because they are dependent to drugs and need a drug, they should go to treatment. Then we have the people that have more quantity of drugs than what is permitted, because Mexico never introduced the recommendation of the 1988 Convention to prohibit drug use. So drug use is not prohibited, and you can carry a small amount for your personal use. In 1994, it was a big quantity. Then it became a smaller quantity, and this quantity was too low. So the problem is that it does not follow the market, so you can have less cocaine than how it is sold in the legal market, or less heroin that a drug addict can need for his immediate use and not going into withdrawal. So when that happened, more people came to jail. But the most important issue in the people going to jail are females that have been used as, we say in Spanish, mulas. I don't know how to, you all say that. So they take the drugs because of their husband, boyfriends, and around 40% are indigenous females that should not be in jail. So I think that if we come to a public health perspective and we make a better response, that would be important. Public health perspective also allows to differentiate between types of drugs. It also understands the importance of treatment, and then I think we're going to talk later on that, and harm reduction measures, and that will reduce violence for one part of the problem, and also can learn from the experience of alcohol and tobacco, how to regulate, how to modify our laws, so we have a better approach to the drug issues.
So if I can maybe paraphrase in part, you're saying decriminalize the simple possession of drug use. Don't criminalize it, but use a public health approach. Is that correct?
Well, in Mexico, it is not criminalized. It's just that the amount that is allowed to be used, to be with yourself, it's too low, too small. So I believe that we need to increase that so people that need treatment don't go to jail, and people that need prevention don't go to jail, or if people that have no problems don't go to jail.
So, Rodrigo, what are the obstacles for countries, and Maria Elena mentioned the incredible violence, the most violent country in the world is in Central America. What are the obstacles to countries adopting the public health approaches you both used to reduce violence and drug use?
Well, some of you might remember I have a pie chart of the different risk factors that affect violence. Two of them, as I mentioned before, are key: the quality and effectiveness of the police and the judiciary systems. Those are the two pillars in which society stands. So first, reconstruct the police. And we had the opportunity in Colombia that which you don't have in Mexico, the national police. And they passed a law saying anyone, just because under suspicion that is being related to the traffic, could be fired. And they took out 3,500 police officers in Colombia. Probably there were many people that were not affected, but the matter of fact was that this changed dramatically. This cannot be done in Mexico because police are municipal. Police, I don't know how many thousand police are, so it's more difficult. But then the judicial system also. We have not had that success in improving or purifying the judicial system for those two. But then there are many others which are related to a culture of violence. We tend, in Colombia, we had long history of civil wars, of periods of high killings like violencia política we had in the 60s. More than 250,000 Colombians were killed, the two political. And this has left a lot of resentment of cultural ties, people that remember that their father were killed. And so there's a cultural remnant that will influence. But there are others which I believe are key, and they take time. One is the correction of inequalities, because definitely the drug traffickers utilize young people that are outside of the school system that need money, need income, and they don't have it. So they pull them or attract them to the drug traffic. So unless you solve that basic problem, you will be always having that. In fact, we are now experiencing in Colombia a very interesting phenomenon. Illegal gold mining done by organized crime is taking place. Instead of growing coca in the areas, they are moving into illegal gold mining, which is the same type of people. They just simply change from coca to illegal gold mining. So unless you solve the basic social points, that contradiction that are there, you will be moving from one to the other. So you have to understand that you have to act. And the other thing is that these things take time. It's not a matter of a mayor 4 years can change things. We have destroyed Colombia over 100 years. We are not going to rebuild it in 4 years. It will take another number of years to rebuild it.
Well, as you both said, drugs are just one of a series of products that organized crime gangs are using. And if you're interested, there's a very good book out right now by one of the Economist's journalists, I think his name is Tom Wainwright, who really equates organized crime gangs to Walmart. So if you're interested, pick that book up. It came out very recently, and it's very, very good. Maria Elena, we've got about 10 minutes left before we go into Q&A with the audience. So please think of your questions and come up and ask both Maria Elena and Rodrigo what you'd like. But Maria Elena, what specific public harm reduction strategies do you think can be adopted and should be adopted by countries, not only in the Americas, in Central America and Latin America, but also here in North America?
I just want to say something before, very rapidly, and is that you asked this question: what are the obstacles for a public health perspective? And I think this is very important, because I think that's the way we will find a solution, as Rodrigo practiced in Colombia. And the issue is because there are three paradigms for the drug problem. One is the health, and that's very, we know that public health works. The other one is security. So we don't want a definition of national security, but we want a definition of civil security, security that people can come out of their houses without fear, without being robbed, attacked, or murdered. So we need security, and for those, I think we have solutions that need to come together. The third one is the liberty, the right of persons to decide their own life, and that's a human right. So how can you then control or decide over personal liberty or personal freedom over public health? No? So public health, again, would be the link of the three main discussion points. No? So what happens in Central America is that it is very difficult after many, many years of thinking in a security problem to change the paradigm. So what we need is that the people from the public health ministries work together with the security ministries so they can find a new definition that both can agree on. So I think that's something that public health can do. And of course, have a more strong voice against considering that the freedom of the human individual is beyond the benefit of the whole population. So I think that those are issues. And regarding this issue comes harm reduction. And harm reduction are wonderful measures. We know that methadone substitution treatment is a harm reduction. Breath analysis for preventing accidents with alcohol, and now maybe growing also with cannabis, is a harm reduction. But when you talk of harm reduction, people don't want to hear it because they feel that harm reduction is a synonymous of free market, of not only decriminalization, but legalizing use, production. And so it was like a forbidden word for many, many years. But harm reduction can do really a change. So what's happening in Mexico? The treatment system takes care of prevention, because there are many kids that are starting to use, and there are a lot of opportunities for them to get services for developing life skills, or if they're starting to have problems, to have brief interventions. But heavy drug addicts don't have really access to treatment. So if the law says that you can have personal dose of heroin, but the third time that you are caught by the police, you can go to jail or to treatment, and if you don't have enough treatment, then it's a regression measure, because it will bring people that need treatment to jail, and there is no treatment in jail where, by the way, should be. So I think we need to think very, very carefully of what amount a drug user can have with them so they don't go to jail, but that we ensure that they have treatment and we ensure access to treatment, because it's not enough to have the premises. You have to have outreach programs that are effective. You have to have many measures there. So that would be another harm reduction measure for heavy drug addicts that we very badly need. And I'm seeing here that we have people from a very interesting project in Tijuana working very hard for that, coming from the lessons of HIV prevention. So I think that's something that we know works, and we have to learn from HIV and do that. What other harm reduction measure we need? We need to find ways to, what do you do with a person that is arrested? Should the police in the first hand do something to take them to a place where they can get help? Part of the problem is that police cannot identify who is an addict and who is not an addict. And then I think that the Portuguese model, that all persons are taken to a house where they are, well, they call it like, but an institution where they are diagnosed and then decide what type of intervention they need, either treatment, long-term treatment, brief treatment, orientation, whatever they need, and so they can decide where to take the persons, because otherwise they will end, most of the population that are caught with drugs are not drug-dependent persons, so they would not need treatment. They need other alternatives maybe. So we have to think on that measure also, which is very difficult because it's not a measure that prohibits drug, but it's a measure that helps the person. So I think it's also part of the change of the paradigm with harm reduction that we will need. And then we can think of many other, but I don't want to take the time.
No, that's just, go ahead, Rodrigo.
Yes.
And we'll please start lining up your questions.
This is a point that to me is the most important. Probably you won't share my opinion. You have to have reliable information on what's going on, because if you don't have it, you cannot administer a thing. We have had in the past periods during which police, for example, they didn't call homicides those injured that they took to hospitals, died 3 or 4 days. They established a particular category that's called disease, whatever that means. So, and then information on the hands of the community. We strive to say that we have to reach the stage that the economists have done with economic numbers, unemployment rates, illiteracy rates, all these inflation rates. Everybody knows it. And this puts pressure on the government because we are evaluated by results. Unless we have reliable data on homicides that can put pressure on the mayors and say, look, what are you doing? You have to. But they have to be reliable, which is very difficult because so many interested parties in establishing it. They may hire. Once I went to see the numbers of homicides in Bogota. I found 174 violent deaths that were unstudied. And I always tease them because somebody with six shots in the back, and they say, we don't know if it's self-inflicted or we don't know if it's accidental, because simply they don't have any information. They found it with 6 shots in the back. To us, it's a homicide, definitely. Anything taking place up to 30 days after the injury is a homicide. So those things have to be carefully monitored and be available to the community. So that will put pressure on the government to force the results to be evaluated.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Please line up. For those of you who are interested, please look at what Rodrigo is an epidemiologist, Harvard trained, and his use of epidemiology to deal with the violence in Cali is truly fascinating. So if you have a chance to take a look at what he's done, please do. And also, Maria Elena has worked very closely with the National Institute for Drug Abuse, one of NIH's centers. Please take a look at the collaboration that she's had with NIDA and the work that Nora Volkow, who is the director of NIDA, the work that they've both been doing to deal with this scourge is really inspiring, and I think needs all of our backing and support to be able to share these initiatives and move them forward. Please line up and ask your questions. And please, if you make your questions short, we've got 14 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, the third topic on your title is migration. Do you want to touch on that?
Thank you. I think it is a very important one. People migrate from Mexico for different reasons. They started to be an economical reason, and now violence is also a main reason that people from Central America and Mexico come to the U.S. Running away from violence. What we have found is that the persons that migrate to the U.S. Used to have lower rates of mental disorders, lower rates of substance abuse, but they had this terrible experience that triggered migration, and then the experiences during migration. So they have that risk factor. They come to the United States. They have more money and no community, not family support, or I would say surveillance, and then they start taking drugs. Males very rapidly. Females after a period of transculturation or adapting to the new culture. And then when they come back to Mexico, they bring the drug problems that we have to deal with. And we should deal with it because migrants are our responsibility also. So, but this is an issue. But violence plays a very important role on migration, and then in the persons who really become dependent and go into drugs because they don't have any support or help. No? So I think that's something that we should work together. Migrants are our responsibility, joint responsibility. Drugs, our joint responsibility, and guns, are our joint responsibility. I think that would be the three main issues.
Thank you, Maria Elena. Please.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Diana Montoya, and I'm a pediatrician. And in listening to you talk about the root of the problems that cause all of these issues, I wonder whether there's any initiatives or projects that you guys are aware of that have worked targeting more children before they get involved with the drug trade, before they're facing the social and economic inequalities that their parents are now facing that lead them to then walk down the path that leads to drugs. What kind of social interventions or projects are you aware of that could potentially work?
That's a wonderful question. I'm going to ask us for psychosocial intervention. I'm sure Rodrigo can answer about the more macro interventions. But yes, what we have seen is that people that are victims of violence have an increased risk of suicide, of mental disorders, of substance abuse disorders. But what makes the difference in behavioral problems is criminal activity on the parents. So we find that way of reproducing the violence cycle. No? What can you do? Of course, for instance, we've made very big research with people living in the streets, children that leave their houses mainly because they're victims of violence, or they sometimes come to the street, sometimes go to their houses. And what we have found is even these very poor people that live in these terrible conditions, that work in the streets, sometimes take money to their houses. When the family relation is strong enough, even though they are in these highly risk environments, they are significantly less prone to use drugs than the ones that don't have this. For females, it is the type of relationship. For males, is the opportunity social for work and jobs. So what we have done is do that interventions to address the risk factors, and we don't have time to go over them, but they are even in these very high problematic populations and with other type of populations similar, they are psychosocial interventions that work quite well. We have other challenges there. I won't take time, but we can, of course, talk about that later. But maybe Rodrigo can say, because that was his main contribution.
Well, many years ago, the American Psychological Association did a survey of studies that were effective in prevention of youth violence. And they concluded that the most cost-effective interventions were those done at the very early stages of life, the 5 years of life. That was an empirical discovery. Nowadays, we have begun to understand why. Because the children that are abused, they develop tracts inside their brains, tiny brains, that favor the violence solution of conflicts. If they grow up in these environments, either suffering or witnessing violence, and then they go to school and they suffer bullying, they will be very prone to react violently when they get to the young age. And even more, now there are these modern tomography units have shown that abused children do not develop the frontal lobe, which is the lobe tip characteristic of the human species, the one that controls emotions, that empathy is there. All these things are affected by what can be done. First, parental training, explaining parents how they can establish authority and teach principles, which is something most parents would like, without being violent. This is a well-known wealth of studies. And the other thing that is establishing these daycare centers. In Cali, 2/3 of the mothers of the slums are single mothers. So it means that they have to go out during the day to work, and they leave their children outside. Either they lock them at house, or they put them, some cases they tie them in places. But if you have places where they can go and receive proper psychological and physiological and nutritional stage, and they will, when they come back at 5 p.m., they take their children back, that will be a change. So that will be those interventions that are related to that change, which I believe are absolutely necessary.
Thank you very much. Yes, Miss.
Hello, my name is Tricia McCann, and I'm a family physician that spends a lot of time in Chiapas, Mexico. And actually, that was a great point. I'm learning a lot more about adverse childhood events, and Harvard actually has like a great website on that if you're more interested in adverse childhood events. But I have two questions that are pretty quick. Well, maybe not quick, but Rodrigo, you had mentioned that kind of the drug cartels were involved in the judicial and the police, and how did you guys get them out of that? Because working in Mexico, everyone's like, well, the drug cartels are involuntarily controlling a lot of what's going on in the government, and if there's anything that we can learn from Colombia for Mexico. And then my other comment was about, I was just at a women's health conference, and we had women who had suffered from drugs, and they had been in jail, and they had said that they thought it was a good thing for them because they were able to get treatment. And so I thought that was, I had never thought of it that way before, and so if we can do a better job of linking up treatment with the jail system. So.
I will try to answer the first, and then Maria Elena will certainly answer the second. I mentioned that in Colombia, the police was absolutely corrupted down to the highest levels. But there was a law passed giving the power to the commander of the police and to the president of the republic to remove anyone from the police without any, they didn't have to say the reason. They say, you are out, like somebody that you know, you're out in this country. Then that took out 3,500 police officers, and a new breed came. All have to go to university. They have university degrees. So there was they changed completely the police. Nowadays, the police is completely different than the one I had to face 20 years ago. The judicial system, we have not been able to do it. The only way is going through the law schools. And we Colombians are pathologically attached to law. So wherever you always find a thing that will say that you have a lawyer to defend it. So it has been much more difficult to do that, but the police certainly changed because of that law. But then
No, I completely agree with you. We have to provide treatment in jails and outside the jails, mostly outside, so people don't go to jail, and change the regulations. So that is something that is going to be proposed in UNGAS, and I think that that will have, I think, good, hopefully, will be received good, and because also the conventions are favor this type of interventions. I just wanted to say a little bit more about migration, because most migrants survive and are resilient and come to this country and then come back to Mexico, many of them, and they are able to overcome, the ones that stay here and the ones that go to Mexico, all these different issues, most of them. Some of them need special care, and I think it's our duty to do so, and the ones that did need special care, unfortunately, are the risk factor is violence, and we need to take care of that issue. No? So just not to make a wrong impression that all migrants get problems because they take drugs and have mental disorders in a lower rate than the US population. But the second generation in the US is the one that has the highest rates of both issues, higher than the US population. So there are many cultural factors associated with this we don't have time to deal with, but I think we have to really not stereotypize or affect the migrants just because of problems they might have.
Well, I wanted to thank you all for being here today, and I think we certainly hope that drug policies can change in our countries to take a more public health approach and to see this as a medical problem and less a judicial problem. Both of you, Maria Elena and Rodrigo, what you have done and where you have done it took immense courage in ways that we will not know. So I want to thank you very much for being here today, for sharing your views and your expertise with us. And I think at the UN General Assembly special session that will start on the 19th of April, I hope that they listen to Kofi Annan's words, who said that drugs have killed many people, but bad policies have destroyed many more lives. So we hope that will be first and at the forefront of that discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.